Go ahead, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions. Laughter.
Anything further, counsel?
Unfortunately, yes. It will be brief. You were asked by Mr. Mesereau with regard to the time frame for which the contents of what you call 317, we're calling 470, the black briefcase. Okay.
Okay.
They were sent for fingerprint analysis around November of 2004, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, with regard to those items inside of that briefcase, were they sent to other forensic evaluation prior to the time that they were fingerprinted?
Yes, they were.
Was that according to the game plan that was put together by the group as to how those things should be processed?
Yes, they were.
And the forensic analysis for the same exhibits that were eventually fingerprinted began very early on?
Yes, it was.
Nothing further.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. You may step down. Call your next witness.
Mr. Zonin is.
Everybody's leaving me, Judge.
Mr. Zonin went to get your next witness.
They're getting him. Mr. Auchincloss's witness, Your Honor. He should be coming.
Oh, I decided the time Monday for you to come in is 11:30. We'll start the jury at 11:30.
Thank you.
Come forward, please.
Your Honor, our next witness will be Dr. Antonio Cantu.
Come forward to the witness stand, please. When you get to the witness stand, remain standing, face the clerk and raise your right hand.
I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
Thank you. My name is Antonio Cantu. Last name is spelled Cantu.
Thank you.
Your Honor, could I inquire who the people are who are standing in the aisleway?
Yes, you may. Your Honor.
I did ask the court.
I'm sorry.
The court doesn't know.
So I will be happy to explain.
Go ahead.
Your Honor, as we mentioned in chambers, we have a demonstration of the scenescope, which is the technology that was used in this case for purposes of finding latent fingerprints. And if, with the court's permission, I would like to allow our Detective Sutcliffe to set up the scenescope while I'm beginning my examination.
All right, go ahead.
If that's permissible. Good afternoon, Dr. Cantu.
Good afternoon, sir.
Who do you work for, please?
I work for the United States Secret Service, the Forensic Services Division within the United States Secret Service.
And what do you do for the Secret Service?
I am the Chief Scientist, Research Scientist, for the Forensic Services Division. And my many duties includes the chemistry and physics of things having to do with documents. For example, fingerprints, or inks on paper, or any other items that may be found on a document.
How long have you worked for the Secret Service in this capacity?
Well, I've been with the Secret Service about 20 years. And I've been working in this particular area, among others, for that extended period of time.
And tell me about what training you've had that qualifies you for your position there. Maybe I'll back up. First of all, tell me specifically what your title is with the Secret Service.
I'm a Chief Forensic Scientist.
And what qualifies you for that position? What training have you had?
Well, first of all, I have a degree in chemistry. Chemical physics, actually, and I've had some training in forensic science. I spent about 10 years at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms Laboratory, where I developed the expertise particularly in the area of the analysis of documents from a chemical and physical point of view.
Tell me about your experiences with the Secret Service. In terms of what work you've done for them in the past.
Most of the work that I have done for the Secret Service falls into two general areas. I spent part of my time over there doing some work in the area called protective research, which has to do with coming up with countermeasures to possible threats that would involve chemical, or biological, or different materials. But the rest of the time has been really the area of forensic science, where my expertise has been mostly in the area of the analysis of documents from a chemical and physical point of view, as I mentioned.
Have you had any published papers in the area of forensic science?
I've already published about 26 papers that I have in the field of forensic science.
Any of them in fingerprint analysis, or?
There are, About 7 of those are in fingerprints, and 2 are pending publication at the moment.
How long have you been involved in the chemistry of fingerprints?
In excess of 20 years.
And can you tell me what the International Fingerprint Research Group is?
That is a group of international experts that, most of which, specialize in the area of coming up with new technology for visualizing fingerprints, for developing fingerprints. And the biggest centers involved in this are Israel, England, Australia, and of course us in the United States. And we started that group at the US Secret Service back in the middle 80s. And now we meet every couple of years, different parts of Europe and the United States and Canada.
Are you involved in developing new techniques in locating latent fingerprints?
Yes. New techniques, particularly in the visualization of fingerprints. We are responsible for developing a new technique for visualizing fingerprints, particularly those that are visualized normally by the use of ninhydrin. And it's a technique for essentially looking at fingerprints on paper and coming up with better, more sensitive methods. There's another technique for looking at the fats and oils in fingerprints, and we help develop new advances in that area, being able to bring them out better, and looking at weaker prints and being able to see them better with this technology. And then thirdly, I've been involved in a technique that has to do with the use of ultraviolet light basically in visualizing fingerprints.
Tell me, what does the term, latent fingerprint, mean?
It's not noticeable. I mean, it's basically a fingerprint that is not noticeable to the human eye but becomes noticeable by means of either chemical or physical techniques.
And can you explain for the jury exactly what it is, from a chemistry point of view, that creates a fingerprint on a surface when a human hand touches it?
Well, our fingers bear certain chemicals on them. These chemicals are on the surface of the hand. And every time you touch something, there is some transferability of those chemicals onto the surface that you touch. And what we do, in our field, is try to find methods of making those things be visible, either by optical methods or chemical methods or physical methods. And to be able to do that, one has to, first of all, know what is in fingerprint residue, that is, what chemicals, so you know what sort of reagents to use to make them visible. So that's the general philosophy that is used in developing fingerprints.
Can I have just a moment?
Yes. Off-the-record discussion held at council table.
All right. So tell me specifically, you mentioned that there are biological substances that are left behind by a fingerprint, by the human hand.
Correct.
Okay. Can you describe the basic grouping of chemicals that are left behind by a human fingerprint?
There are several chemicals. I can generally group them into those that are water-soluble chemicals, and they include amino acids, and those that are water-insoluble, and they are the ones that are normally referred to as the fats or oils, or more precisely, lipids. And the water-soluble ones contain amino acids, proteins, salts, and other things. But it is the amino acids that are really the target items that we look at to try to visualize these things. As far as the water-insoluble ones, it's usually the lipids or the fats and oils that we use as the materials that we target chemicals or methods to be able to visualize these.
So, tell me, what are the biological origins of the water-soluble group of materials that is left in fingerprints?
Well, I'll give you an answer to both the water-soluble and water-insoluble. The water-soluble ones are the ones that are found mostly on the palms of your hand or the soles of your feet. And there you have one type of gland referred to as an eccrine gland, and they are the ones that release the amino acids and certain proteins that are water dispersible, and certain salts. But there are other glands as well. There's some that you have that are different from the eccrine gland. The armpits or the groin area have glands referred to as apocrine glands, and they release other forms of water-soluble material. And then the third group of glands that we have in our skin are referred to as the sebaceous glands, and these are the ones that actually put out the lipids or the fats and oils. And they exist in the scalp and the face and the nose area. And of course anywhere where you have hair you would have these glands as well.
So if I understand correctly, your hand doesn't have any oil glands?
That's correct.
Or fingers?
I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt for just a second. I understand Detective Sutcliffe is going to be a witness, and I didn't object to him just coming in during the preliminaries here and helping to set this up, but I don't think he should be here during the testimony.
That's fine. I will call him back for the demonstration, if that's permissible.
But all witnesses are excluded on both sides.
I did notify counsel that Detective Sutcliffe was here setting it up when he was doing so. To Detective Sutcliffe, all right. We'll call you back in, Detective, as soon as we get to the demonstration. Thank you. All right, So getting back to these substances that leave fingerprints, there's no lipids or oil glands, sebaceous glands, in your fingertips, is that true?
True. Yes, that is correct.
But sometimes you will leave lipids or oils or fatty substances that are produced by your body by your sebaceous glands on a fingerprint.
That is correct.
And how does the oil get on the finger?
Normally by touching your face or your hair would be one way of transferring that material onto your fingers.
I see. And is that a common way of establishing a fingerprint that's based on fatty oils or oils?
Yes. If you find the fatty oils in there, it's usually assumed that they come from that contact, or perhaps handling something exogenous, something outside, like face creams and lotions or food.
Okay.
Stuff like that.
So is that a third grouping that can produce a fingerprint? Foreign substances?
Yes.
Non-biological substances, or something that came outside the body?
That is correct.
Okay. So, tell me, explain to me what optical methods are used in visualizing these latent prints when they're left behind.
Optical methods would be, there are about 4 methods that I will describe. One of them is just a visual examination of the material that you're looking at that may have the fingerprints. And occasionally lighting in a certain direction. Or if a print, for example, is one which is found on something like clay or putty, you can actually see the imprint in there, very, very simply. And, otherwise, you have to use other methods. Now, there are cases as well where you have a print that's heavy laden with material, and you touch something, and then you can say, oh, you made a smudge on the glass, or, a smudge on the TV, or, a smudge on my screen. That's, again, some of the residue that you leave behind. And sometimes that could be actually seen without anything else but just proper illumination. When some of these fail and cannot be photographed or documented, then there are other methods that are used. For example, you could use ultraviolet light. And there's certain proteins and amino acids that actually fluoresce when illuminated with ultraviolet light. They fluoresce in the ultraviolet. Tryptophan is one such material that does that. And for that, you illuminate with the ultraviolet light and view it in the ultraviolet region. And then there are other cases in which you may find fluorescence, but in this case, visible. That is, you illuminate with a visible light and then block it with, for example, a green light produced by a laser, and then you block that with orange goggles and you see some fluorescence. And if it's inherent, if it comes from the skin, that is normally due to perhaps bilirubin, that's a biological chemical, that may be in the hand. And then lastly, a method that is used for very smooth surfaces, very glass-like surfaces, would be a reflectance technique. You illuminate, and you view this thing in a reflected mode. And the most sensitive of those would be viewing in the ultraviolet. That is, you illuminate with ultraviolet, then you have to have something that sees in the ultraviolet. So there's imaging devices that are capable of viewing in the ultraviolet, and that's what we use.
So if I understand correctly, you might use different methods depending upon the surface. Is that fair to say?
That's
for looking for latents.
That's correct.
And is it also fair to say that different methods might capture a fingerprint that is amino acid based or water soluble based? True. Some methods are designed to capture the protein-based residue. Is that fair to say?
Yes, sir.
And are some methods more suitable for capturing the oil-based residue?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so I didn't ask you this question, but I think the jury understands it. Is it true that the amino or protein product that might be left behind, is that something that comes from the finger itself?
Yes.
Okay. So the amino acids are something that your finger secretes.
That is correct.
Okay, alright. So tell me, if I touch something, does that mean it's going to leave a fingerprint?
Not necessarily.
And why do you say that?
Well, there are several reasons why it may not, and one of them is your hand is quite dry and just doesn't transfer anything. And secondly, the surface may be one that sort of rejects any sort of materials that may be put on it and it doesn't have the absorbency of the material that's on your finger. And then thirdly, the surface may be quite corrugated or textured and the transfer may be there, but it's not very resolvable.
Is it fair to say that textured objects are poor surfaces for fingerprints?
Generally, yes, they are, depending on the roughness of the surface.
For shiny, smooth paper, such as you might find in a magazine, can you please describe how one detects latent fingerprints that magazine may hold?
Well, I mentioned earlier, I answered the question about the optical methods, and one of the optical methods that I mentioned earlier was the fact that if you have a very smooth surface or glass-like surface, you could use these reflected ultraviolet techniques. And for something that's a very, very smooth surface, like a magazine paper, something like that, one of the first techniques that I would use would be to see if it could be visualized without doing anything to it. That is, just by seeing if this technique of reflected ultraviolet visualization will bring out anything. And then the next step.
Let's stop right there. What do you mean by reflected ultraviolet? Tell me specifically what you do to examine this piece of paper for fingerprints without the aid of anything else, other than perhaps reflected ultraviolet.
I'll do it by means of an example.
Okay.
If you put, for example, your finger on a piece of glass, that's a very smooth surface. You sometimes can turn that glass around and actually see the print on there. When you view it in the ultraviolet, that's magnified immensely, and it's due to the fact that the fingerprint residue itself becomes very reflective. And secondly, it's a scatter media for the light. It just casts the light and reflects it in multi-directions. The fingerprint material becomes like micromirrors. It becomes very reflective in UV. And that's essentially how this thing is able to enter the fingerprint on a very smooth surface. And of course, paper that is very glossy is of this category as well.
So is that ultraviolet light, is that synonymous with ALS, or alternative light source?
No, sir.
That's something different.
That is correct.
Okay, so if you looked at it with ultraviolet light, would that be something different than a cinescope?
No.
It would be the same as a cinescope.
It is similar to a cinescope.
Okay. Would you use, now, I guess the common notion is that ultraviolet light is something like a black light.
That is correct.
Okay. Is that what we're talking about here?
A little more than that.
Tell me what you mean.
Black light, that you normally hear, is what you may see in places of entertainment where they have the ultraviolet light tubes called black lights. That light is ultraviolet, but the wavelength of it is, first of all, it's for the eye-safe reason, and that's the same sort of ultraviolet that the sun puts out. The one I'm talking about is shorter wavelength. It is the ultraviolet light that the sun puts out, but it's sort of blocked by the ozone layer of the Earth. You don't get those rays, the shorter wavelength rays. And the reason this technology works so well is because the shorter the wavelength, the better you can see this surface roughness that may be caused by the fingerprint on the object. And the shorter the wavelength, the less that surface has to be in size. In other words, the shorter the wavelength, the one that we use is called 254 nanometers. That can detect roughnesses, or it can scatter the roughness of 1/100,000th of an inch. So it works very well for very, very light fingerprints on surfaces.
Okay, so tell me what a ridge is.
Well, a ridge is in a fingerprint, it is the raised portion of the fingerprint that meanders throughout the finger.
So it's like one of the lines in the fingerprint.
That's correct.
So using that as an example, a ridge would be material that is on the surface that you're looking at. Is that fair to say?
That's correct. When you transfer the chemicals, you actually transfer the pattern that's found on the ridges.
Okay, and when the light hits the ridge, you said it scatters. Can you give me a little better idea what that means?
Yes. When the light hits the ridge, it actually reflects, but in multiple directions.
And if I understand correctly, the ultraviolet light will reflect in multiple directions, but the daylight that we have is too big a wavelength to scatter and make the print visible.
It doesn't scatter as well.
Okay, so the ultraviolet light with the shorter wavelength scatters better.
That is correct.
And allows you to see the print better.
That is correct.
Okay. Now, that was the first method. We just started talking about the methods of trying to find fingerprints on a magazine. What next? What else would you do on shiny magazine paper?
Okay, what we described so far is, there's no chemical treatment. No nothing. You just see the raw fingerprint. The next step that you would do on surfaces like that, or any non-porous surface as well, would be to use fuming with a gas. And the gas is referred to as cyanoacrylate ester, or better known as superglue. And the superglue gases, when they see, for example, fingerprint residue, they see in it things that trigger its polymerization, basically a material that is basic, like amino acids. Water is another substance, or moisture triggers this condensation and polymerization of the cyanoacrylate material that's in the gaseous form, and that basically forms around the fingerprint and becomes another way of visualizing the fingerprint. Normally they appear whitish in color after you finish doing the polymerization. So in essence, you put the material in this vapor, and the polymerization occurs around the fingerprint. And then you pull it out, and you sometimes can see the fingerprint in there. But it does a couple of things. It hardens the fingerprint, and it also makes it just slightly bigger than what it was before as far as the thickness. So, if you don't see the fingerprint by means of this method, then you can submit it again to the ultraviolet reflection, and the super glue treatment actually enhances, even, that more. I've seen cases where, for example, I had a substance in which I saw, let's say, 10 fingerprints using the using the ultraviolet technique. It's referred to as reflected ultraviolet imaging system. I just called it RUVIS, but that's what it stands for. And then I did super gluing, and multiple more fingerprints showed up after that with the RUVIS, with the reflected ultraviolet system.
So you take a magazine, and you said you somehow coat it with this super glue. Is that how it works? You put a very fine coat of super glue on the magazine.
It only condenses primarily around the portions where the fingerprint residue is.
Okay. And is this cyanoacrylate, whatever you said, is this the same product that we use at home as superglue?
Yes, it's a cyanoacrylate ester.
And when you say polymer, what does that mean, polymerization?
The polymerization process is basically the single molecule of the cyanoacrylate ester, and just, chemically it multiplies itself and becomes a very long chain, and that's referred to as a polymer.
So what is the process of getting this polymer to condense around the fingerprints? What happens in the lab when they do that? What do they do?
Oh.
How do they get it to?
The way it's normally done, you have a shaver, and some people actually use something like a fish tank. And they get the cyanoacrylate liquid, like your super glue, and put it in a small aluminum dish. And you heat this by putting it on a heating pad, or a heating mantle, or some sort of heating source. And also you have some water on the site. It's the moisture content that is used to condense around the fingerprint residue. And then you let it sit there for a period of time. It sits probably 10 minutes or more, and then by that time, you can begin to see the fingerprints being developed on the material. And then you take it out. And basically that's about it. It is a very simple process that you see periodically on CSI, referred to as, super glue fuming.
Does super glue fuming enhance the water-based materials, the oil-based materials, or some combination?
It enhances both.
Okay. So it enhances, whatever material is there, it will condense and form a bigger ridge or a more visible ridge. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. As far as the water-soluble material, it has the amines. As far as the water-insoluble material, it has certain lipoproteins, and proteins contain the amines. And there's also moisture condensed in there as well.
So let's talk about RUVIS. You mentioned that term, reflective ultraviolet imaging system.
Yes.
What is RUVIS? How is that technology normally used in forensic science?
I've used that term maybe 2 or 3 times in my discussion, and it involves 2 things. The system itself, the imaging system, and the illuminator. The illuminator is simply an ultraviolet lamp, but works in that short wavelength region. I might add, if you're not familiar with the short wavelength region, stamp collectors normally use that to be able to examine their stamps. US stamps have material in it that only glows under short wave, not long wave. So you would see that type of lamp among stamp collectors. So anyway, it is that type of lamp that you use to illuminate your substance that you're examining. And then you image it with a system that is capable of seeing that region. Human eyes can only see in the so-called visible region. It doesn't see ultraviolet, it doesn't see infrared, so you have to use special imaging systems to see in those regions. In the infrared, you have things called night vision scopes. In the ultraviolet, there are scopes out there that have intensified tubes in there that can see in the ultraviolet, and that's what we currently have. The optical system for viewing has a filter in front of that system that only allows the short wavelengths to go through. So essentially you're illuminating with light that is of a certain frequency. To be exact, it's 254 nanometers. And then you have a filter on the system that is only able to allow that wavelength to go through. So that the so-called imager consists of the filter, a lens, which has to be made out of quartz, otherwise ultraviolet light couldn't go through. And then inside is referred to as an image intensifier. Basically it converts that ultraviolet light that's hitting the surface into visible light, into a phosphor, and then you are able to see it at the other end. And some people put a camera at the other end to view that, or other people can just look at that phosphor screen and see the image. So basically that's what the reflected ultraviolet imaging system is.
Now, you've talked about infrared, and you've talked about ultraviolet. Are those the two ends of the light spectrum?
Well, the two ends of the visible spectra. There's more to it than a one end and more to it on the other.
Okay.
But if you have the visible spectra, the so-called lower end would be the ultraviolet, the higher end would be the infrared.
Okay. Now, the infrared is tell me about the technology that is used in a product called the scenescope.
The scenescope is basically what I just described as the RUVIS, the reflected ultraviolet imaging system. It consists of a scope that is able to see in the ultraviolet, a filter, and the illuminating light, and a camera sometimes sits on top. And it's actually on the stand there, that you see.
So this object to my left here is a scenescope with a camera mounted on it.
That's just the one part. That's just the viewing portion. I don't see the illuminator set up yet.
Would this be the illuminator?
That would be the illuminator.
Okay. So the scenescope has an ultraviolet light, true?
Correct.
And a special device that makes that light visible, is that true?
That is correct.
Okay. So it works in two different realms, or two different ways. It projects ultraviolet light and then allows you to look through a special instrument to see that ultraviolet light.
The reflected light.
The reflected light. Okay. And I think you previously explained that this light is uniquely suitable to observe the scatter effect of very tiny residue that's left by fingerprints
on smooth surfaces.
Alright. So, lastly, we haven't talked about ninhydrin. You've mentioned it, but we haven't really described what it is. What is ninhydrin?
Well, you've asked me questions about the optical methods of examining for fingerprints. There are also chemical methods, and I alluded to that. The chemical methods are mostly used in porous material like ordinary paper. And normally you take it in two steps. The first step is to look for the water-soluble components, the amino acids. And there you use amino acid visualized in reagents, or reagents that can visualize the amino acids. The most common one that has been around since the 1950s is ninhydrin, and that, when you apply ninhydrin to a piece of paper that has fingerprint residue, and then let it dry, and over a period of time, or you could artificially use some heat and some humidity, the latent fingerprint or the invisible fingerprint turns out to be a purple image of the fingerprint. The reaction between amino acids and ninhydrin is purple, and that chemical is referred to as Rubin's purple.
Is there a certain order? If you're using two different methods to look for fingerprints, is there a certain order you'd want to choose if you're going to use the fuming method, the scenescope, and ninhydrin? Is there a method you'd want to use first before the other one?
Yes. In the case in question, having to do with smooth paper, you would use the optical method first, followed by the cyanoacrylate ester fuming or the superglue fuming, and then the ninhydrin at the very end to look for the amino acids. The cyanoacrylate fuming method does not affect the amino acids, so you could actually see them afterwards. And essentially you try to see if there are more prints. Or sometimes the fingerprints that you develop with ninhydrin are the same ones that the cyanoacrylate or superglue fuming developed.
So you might find a ninhydrin print where you didn't find it with the fuming method.
That is possible, of course.
Why wouldn't you want to use ninhydrin first?
Because it may affect the polymerization of the superglue.
You might lose some fingerprints if you did it that way.
That is correct. It simply involves the application of ninhydrin in a solvent. So it's that solvent that you're trying to avoid from getting onto your evidence before anything else. So that's why you do all these optical methods first.
Are these methods that you've described for looking for fingerprints on smooth magazine-type paper, are they time-tested methods that are accepted by law enforcement agencies around the world?
As far as I know, they are.
How about in the United States in particular?
Very much so.
Okay. And how long has ultraviolet light been around used in looking for fingerprints?
In that reflected mode that I've been talking about. Excuse me. It started out, I guess, in the early 1970s in Japan, and then it got rekindled again in Japan in the mid-80s. And it was then that the Army Forensic Laboratory in Japan became aware of it. In the middle 80s, late 80s, it was brought over to this country. And we began to use it among just a few of us in the mid-90s. And then later on, toward the end of the 90s, it became more commonly known to other people. And now it's rather common technology known throughout the entire world.
And I think you said ninhydrin has been used for locating fingerprints for how many years?
Oh, that goes back to the 50s.
How about cyanoacrylate, the fuming? How long has that been used to enhance fingerprints?
In the 70s.
And who is the manufacturer of the scenescope?
It's the company that I know that made that is Spex Industries, SPEX Industries. I think they've been bought by a French company, and I just cannot recall the name of that company. But all the times that I've known it as Spex Industries. In fact, their ad still says, SPEX Industries.
And is that how you came to the attention of Santa Barbara County law enforcement, through an introduction from the Spex people?
I would object. That calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Are you sometimes referred by Spex to act as an expert when people request expert testimony on scenescope technology?
I've been asked by Spex about certain technical things to have to do with their system. And yes, I have been asked to be able to say something on the technical nature of their instrument.
Okay. And as a member of the Secret Service, are you being paid anything special for today's testimony?
No, sir.
Is this a service that the Secret Service offers to law enforcement agencies in the United States?
That is correct.
All right. Your Honor, at this time I think we have enough time to do a brief demonstration. I'll ask Dr. Cantu if he can tell me, first off, what would be a good way to do a proper demonstration of the scenescope? Just a simple demonstration to show how it works.
Well, I think you have it all set up. I don't quite see the monitor to see the image.
The monitor will show on that screen.
Oh, it will. Okay, fine.
Yes.
All you have to do is turn what I call the intensifier. That's the unit that actually does the conversion of the ultraviolet to the visible and illuminate your material. And that material is going to be, I could get my credit card and put a print on there, and I'll show you how it actually shows through this system. Or I believe the other gentleman that was here has some demonstration sheets as well.
All right. I'm going to ask you to step off the stand at this time. I'm not going to ask you any more questions. But I'll make a couple of requests. And we'll let the detective assist. And if we could have input 4, Your Honor.
Before this occurs, Your Honor, I did have an objection. But in addition to that, this is not preserved. This is something that's going to be up on a screen, I suppose, and it's not preserved as a...
We can ask the detective to take a photograph of each exhibit. And we'll introduce it, if that's permissible. If that's agreeable.
Does that solve your problem?
I'm not asking it be introduced into evidence, but preserved for the record.
Yes, preserved for the record. That's fine.
They'll become exhibits.
Can you do that?
Uh-huh.
All right. I'll ask the detective at this time to find the proper setting for the VHS. And if you please, could you show us the fingerprint in its natural state on the scenescope, without cyanoacrylate fuming or any enhancement? And take a picture of it when you identify that print. Why don't you come out here where the jury can see what you're doing? Just step back.
So I take it that Mr. Sutcliffe is doing the demonstration. It was my impression that Mr. Cantu was going to be asked to do it.
I was going to have Detective Sutcliffe do it. There's no testimony at this time. I'm just asking him to do these 2 demonstrations. What are you doing? Well, why don't you show what you're doing?
Okay.
If you stand over here.
It's just
If you would demonstrate if you would, please, just place a fingerprint, if you will, on that piece of magazine paper and then try and locate it using the scenescope. All right. Did you take a photograph of that?
I will.
Now, if you please, if you have a fingerprint pre-prepared with cyanoacrylate fuming.
I do.
Would you please show that and take a picture of that for the jury?
There is, actually, one is circled, and I have another one.
Wait, he can't testify.
You're not sworn, so you can't testify.
Excuse me, that's it.
All right. And if you would take a picture of that. Thank you, Detective. And you can take this down. Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions for Dr. Cantu. We'll wait just a moment while. Actually, you can just leave it there and come back in after the jury. Okay. We'll take it down afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Cantu, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. You have a PhD in, I think it's chemistry, is it not? What is it?
Chemical physics.
Chemical physics. All right. From the University of Texas in Austin, is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, You indicated that you were familiar with this company that makes the scenescope, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And, in fact, you had something to do with helping this company develop the scenescope, is that correct?
I did to an extent.
And this company is in competition with some other companies regarding the same kind of ultraviolet technology, is that right?
It is now.
Okay, I think last I saw, they're actually suing another company for violating their patents, is that right?
That's unbeknownst to me.
Do you hold a patent on this, first off?
No.
Do you have any business relationship, or have you ever had any business relationship with a company regarding this kind of technology?
No, I had a relationship with a company that helped develop the technology before Specs bought the rights to make it.
And what was the name of that company?
Electro-Optical Systems, Incorporated, in Charlottesville, Virginia.
And did you derive, I'm not going into detail, but did you derive economic benefit for that?
No.
So you worked with that company to help develop something like this, or something that turned into this eventual machine, is that correct?
That is correct.
Alright, now, in this particular case, you said something about a shiny surface, and it was a little unclear. Were you indicating that you had reviewed fingerprints in this case from shiny surfaces in this case?
No.
Okay, so, in fact, you have not actually reviewed any fingerprints in this particular case, is that correct, sir?
No, sir.
Okay, and I just did one of those things I shouldn't do. I said, is that correct? And you said, no. So let me ask the question. Have you reviewed any fingerprints in this particular case?
I have not reviewed any fingerprints in this particular case.
So you're brought in basically. You're asked to come testify basically to how the scenescope works.
Yes, sir.
Alright, you are, nevertheless, familiar with fingerprint evaluation, is that correct?
In this case.
Not in this case in particular, but in general.
I am familiar with fingerprint evaluation.
Okay, you are not a latent print examiner.
No, sir, I'm an expert in this particular area and the chemistry behind the development of fingerprints.
And I didn't mean that in an offensive fashion, but different people do different things. You know what a latent print examiner is?
Yes, I do.
Alright, and what you have told us about is part of the process of doing latent print examinations, correct?
About a part of latent fingerprint examination, yes. I have said that I've spoken about the developmental part of the fingerprint.
Just so we're clear. And we're almost to the end of the day here, so I'll just try to take a short subject. Latent print examination is, what I'm getting at, is a bigger subject than what you've just talked to us about here, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, in other words, when you look at fingerprints, you've told us, for instance, that you may be able to see fingerprints, they're called visible prints, is that correct?
Yes.
And that's because somebody put their finger in paint or something, and you can just see it, correct?
Correct.
It could be any other substance that allows it to be visible. You might have what are called plastic prints, is that correct?
I gave you a couple of examples of that.
Please.
No, I said I gave a couple of examples.
I thought you said you would give. But, for instance, a plastic print might be somebody who puts their finger in clay, and you can actually, the ridges are actually transferred onto the clay, is that correct?
I believe I gave that example. That, and putty are the two examples I gave of the so-called plastic or mold fingerprints.
And then the next category is the latent print. That's the print that you cannot see unaided, is that correct?
That was, yes, sir.
And you told us in general about different processes by which you can get the latent prints so that you can make them capable of being examined, is that correct?
Make them visible, yes.
Visible. So that can either be by light sources, for the ultraviolet light sources, or it can be chemical, is that correct?
And physical.
And physical. Physical, being.
Like powder techniques.
Okay, I see. You wouldn't call that part of chemical. You'd call that.
No, it's adherence. It's an aspect of chemistry in a way. In fact, cyanoacrylate deposition of the polymerization is a physical chemical type of process.
Because it actually not only chemically reacts so that you can see the prints better, but it also actually enhances the structure of whatever is there so that it is more visible, is that correct?
That's the superglue fuming, yes.
Superglue fuming, yes. Alright, now, ultimately fingerprint examination and comparison. When you go beyond what you're talking about, which is developing prints so that you can see them, in essence, fingerprint comparison and examination is a subjective enterprise, is it not?
Fingerprint.
I'll object as beyond the scope. There's been no testimony about comparison.
Overruled.
It's subjective, is it not, sir?
I'm afraid I could not answer that, because it's not part of my expertise.
Okay. You have spoken on the need in recent years to increase the validation studies for the purpose of enhancing fingerprint examination, latent fingerprint examination for court purposes. Is that correct, sir?
No, I have not spoken on that. I've been invited to be at meetings where they're speaking about that.
Okay. You participated in conferences.
Yes.
Counsel, it's the end of the day.
Very well.
See you tomorrow morning.